Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, our two chapters today are 1 Samuel 18 and Mark 14. Now these chapters have a link. It's the link of covenant. So I'd like to explain covenant for a moment. It says here in 1 Samuel 18 that David was at one spirit with Jonathan. They loved each other. And then they made a covenant together. You'll read about in verse 3, going through a few verses. One of the things they did is they exchanged their garments. So Jonathan was wearing his princely garb. He gives it to David. David gives Jonathan his garment. You see, what they were symbolizing with that picture was that everything that I have is yours, yours is mine. Then they exchanged weapons. I don't know what David had, sling, bow and arrow, sword, but Jonathan definitely had a princely sword. They exchanged weapons. They were basically saying, if anyone touches you, they touch me. My strength is going to be used to protect you. And then there were, if you look at these Old Testament covenants, many mysterious things that happened. They ate bread and drank wine as a seal of the covenant. They would take a blade and they would cut their hands and the blood would intermingle, and they would say, everything that is my life is in you, your life is in me. They would exchange names. Remember when Abraham made a covenant with God, Abraham became Abraham. He took the out of the name of God. And so the closest thing we've got these days is the marriage covenant. There's an exchanging of vows. There's an exchanging of names. There's a banquet that celebrates it. And it's basically describing this. One family joining to another family through the mediators who are making the covenant. So when my household, the household of Crawford, was united to the household of Wynn, that was my wife's maiden name, it happened as we mediated covenant together. It was an exchanging of names, exchanging of promises, exchanging of gifts, as these two households joined. So in this chapter, it's quite tricky because the household of Saul, which is the kingly household, is giving covenanted to the household of Jesse, the new king. And Saul hates David, but there's covenant happening between the households. There's a mediation happening between the households. And then it's even more than David and Jonathan. David marries into this household, marries Saul's daughter. Household of Saul, household of Jesse, covenanting together through some very tricky waters. If you fast forward a little while, Jonathan dies, Saul dies, the whole household dies, but one descendant remains, Mephibosheth. He's a crippled guy. We'll read more about him in a couple of weeks' time. But David looks all over Israel, looking for someone in this household that he's covenanted with, that he can effect his promises to, his protection to, his belongings to. And he gives a huge amount of the kingdom to this guy that he finds called Mephibosheth because he's made a covenant. Now you say, God, what has this deal got to do with you and me? Well, Mark 14 explains it. Mark 14 there's a lot here. There's the Last Supper, and where Jesus says this is my blood of the new covenant. You see, here's the word covenant coming again, and Jesus is taking the wine and he's saying, this blood, he's going to hold up his hands in a few minutes. They're going to drive nails through it. Blood is going to come down, and he's going to be making covenant, a scar that forever tells a covenant's been made with his household, which is the household of man. Remember, he came to represent mankind, Son of Man, and he's making this covenant with God himself. He hangs there naked, clothed just like you and I are, because why? He's representing the house of man. And he's busy sitting down having this covenant meal. And so he says, this is the covenant meal. A covenant is being made between the household of God and the household of man. The rest of this chapter has got to do with his betrayal. It's got to do with the people denying him, his anointing. It's all bits and pieces paving the way for the new covenant to be made. And so the new covenant is essentially the household of man. Remember, he called himself the Son of Man, being made joined to the household of God. And he's the mediator, Hebrews chapter 8 tells us, of this covenant. So as he's hanging on the cross, he is making a covenant with us and God. And then we are the recipients, like Mephibosheth, of the blessings of this covenant. So it's like God looks to and fro amongst the earth and he says, who has made a covenant with my son? Who will walk into this covenant blessing that I can protect, that I can look after, that I can provide for? In the household of man, we are like the descendants of Jonathan. We didn't do this covenant. We didn't set this covenant. God did with our great ancestor, Jesus. And means we, and not because of anything we've done, are recipients of the blessing and the protection of God.